Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Sinister. This is another heavily edited chapter. It took me a few days to put together, and I do believe I have some trigger warnings in here. So we will be seeing some child abuse and self-harm. In conjunction with those two things, also we've got some severe gore coming as well, with mangled limbs and stuff like that. And we also have a scene of near non-consensual acts being visited upon certain characters. So nothing happens. There's no rape or anything like that, but it gets a little hedgy in this part. So if that is not something that you feel comfortable listening to today, then perhaps sit this one out. But other than that, let's just get into it. Chapter 7. Easy is the descent. Narcissa put a hand to her mouth. "Your parents," she said, turning to Ron and Ginny, who both looked as if they'd been shocked with electricity. Harry could have sworn that Ron's hair was standing up with alarm. "I'll bet they're just going to murder us," breathed Ron, looking both startled and horrified. "There will be no murders here," said Narcissa briskly, and made a gesture towards Anton. "Anton, go and tell them we're on our way. Ron and Ginny, come with me. Harry, you wait here." "No," said Harry quickly. "I'll come with you. Wait here," said Narcissa in a voice like iron bands. Looking extremely imperious, she swept her robes around her and started out of the room, shooing Ron and Ginny before her like ducklings. After they had gone, Harry stared around the library, which was lined with portraits of pale, blonde, arrogant-looking Malfoys that stared back at him. He felt utterly wrung out. He was just about to sit down in one of the large chairs to rest his eyes for a moment when a tapping at the window caught his attention. Harry turned to see a large tawny owl on the other side of the window that was obviously seeking entrance. Seeing that no one else was around, Harry went over and opened the casement, allowing the owl to swoop in. It landed on the bust of a rather fearful-looking Gorgon, which was sitting on one of the many desks and looked at Harry expectantly. Mechanically, he untied the letter which was attached to its ankle, then searched his pockets for whatever wizarding money he had to hand. Finding a single knot, he paid the owl, and it took off, back through the window and out into the sky, which was turning a beautiful shade of golden afternoon. After the owl had gone, Harry took a curious peek at the letter and saw words scribbled there in an unfamiliar hand. It read, "Mr. Sirius Black, Malfoy Manor, Chipping Sawberry, forwarded by Charlie Weasley." Harry stared at the missive, then glanced at the green and silver ribbon which was affixed to the front. The letter from Snape. Without a second thought, Harry sat down hurriedly in a nearby armchair and tore the seal off the letter and pulled out a single sheet of parchment. He scanned the page, filled with Snape's familiar, cramped handwriting. He read it once, then again, wide-eyed. Then he looked up from the letter and stared blankly around the room, but his eyes registered nothing. "That's it, then," he said in a colorless sort of voice. There was no response from the room around him, which made Harry feel somehow even more despondent than ever. Knowing that the potion would only allow them a few minutes with which to converse with Dumbledore, Sirius wasted no time and began speaking at once. "Headmaster," he began urgently, "do you know who attacked you?"
"A very powerful dark wizard,"
said the smoky form of Dumbledore.
"Not Voldemort, I suspect."
"Do you think it was Slytherin?" asked Sirius, conscious of the incredulous look that Snape darted towards him, an even more incredulous look on his face when Dumbledore said,
"It could very well have been. So little is factually known about Slytherin, it is hard to say. Our assailant was hooded, disguised as a Dementor. He was certainly very powerful, although I do believe I could have held him off if it had not been for Cornelius trying to play the hero. Poor Cornelius."
"He was a fool," hissed Snape, "and he nearly got you killed, Headmaster."
"Now, Severus,"
said Dumbledore in an admonished sort of voice, and Snape subsided.
"Besides this attack, there is also the matter of Draco's enchanted sword," he continued. "One of the only 4 living blades ever forged. 2 have been destroyed. One is in my office in an adamantine case, and the other is in the possession of young Master Malfoy. I cannot emphasize to you how significant that is."
Snape blinked and looked as if he wanted to say something, when a sudden surge of noise from the corridor outside the room prevented him from doing so. Lupin, whose hearing was quite sensitive, could distinguish a jumble of voices, all speaking at once. "The reporters," said Sirius tersely. "I'll go and see what's going on," said the doctor, who looked both perplexed by this turn of events and also stunned into silence by the revelation of the existence of living blades. He scampered off, leaving the rest in an awkward silence until he returned a few seconds later. "Professor Snape," said Dr. Branford nervously, "something's happened. Could you come out here for a moment?" Snape looked outraged. "Can't it wait?" "Well, no, actually," said the doctor.
"It's perfectly all right," said Dumbledore. "Leave us, Severus. You have done what you came here to do."
Looking mad enough to spit nails, Snape went out of the room after the doctor. Lupin was not sorry to see him go. The moment he was gone, Sirius turned to Dumbledore. "Draco's missing," he said. Dumbledore looked grave.
"I rather thought he might be."
"Do you think he's all right?"
"I really don't know,"
said Dumbledore, sounding graver than ever.
"He's a strong boy, as strong as Harry is, and powerful in his own right. But that sword is one of the most powerful magical objects ever created."
"Well," said Lupin, "it's a tool of Slytherin's, isn't it? It does his bidding."
"These are the questions to which I do not have the answer. I was rather hoping that young Master Malfoy could give them to me."
"The sword brought Slytherin back to life," pointed out Lupin.
"Yes, but perhaps not as a reward. Perhaps as more of a punishment. He owes a great debt to the forces that made that sword what it is. If he was brought back, it could be to pay that debt."
"I doubt he'll pay it," said Sirius darkly.
"Indeed," replied Dumbledore. "The sword is a malign force. All Slytherin has to do is sit back and let it do its work."
Lupin narrowed his eyes. "What is its work?"
"I believe the sword was made to fulfill wishes. That's why it was so coveted by Slytherin in the first place. It has been trying to show Draco that it can give him everything he's ever wanted. To succeed where Harry fails. Requited love via the potion."
"But that was an accident," interrupted Lupin. "He just happened to be there. She just happened to see him."
"There are forces at work here that I do not comprehend fully, if at all," said Dumbledore. "I would imagine that the sword, with its connection to Slytherin, knew about the love potion and contrived to place Draco there at that moment. Certainly, there were many factors to take into account, and I may be wrong about the sword trying to fulfill his wishes. Perhaps it was simply trying to torment him. Perhaps it simply found the situation amusing. The sword is a demon, after all. It has a sense of humor, although not one most of us would share. It sees that he wants Miss Granger to love him. Presto! She loves him. It would never grasp that there is more to that wish than the outward appearance of devotion, never grasp why induced love is not and cannot be satisfactory.
What does the sword want? Asked Sirius slowly.
A life, said Dumbledore simply, specifically the life of a Majid. What it was cheated of when Slytherin performed the magic that made him immortal. Slytherin's blood was part of the original bargain. If the sword cannot have a life of Slytherin himself, it will take the life of one of his descendants. Draco's life,
said Sirius, looking pale.
Either Draco's or Harry's, it makes no difference,
said Dumbledore, looking grave once again. Sirius goggled at him. Harry? But Harry is the heir to Gryffindor.
Godric Gryffindor and Salazar Slytherin were cousins, said Dumbledore calmly. Harry's blood will do just as well as Draco's to fill the bargain.
Lupin suddenly leapt to his feet and began pacing. That explains so many things, he said excitedly. Does it? Said Sirius, hoping he didn't look quite as blank as he felt. All this talk of Harry's blood and life was beginning to make him feel panicky, and he was rarely at his best when panicked. He fought down the feeling and looked over at Lupin. What does that explain? I've been puzzling over what reanimated the sword in the first place, what brought it back to life, so to speak. The prophecy states that the sword must be wielded by a descendant of Slytherin for its power to return, but you told me that Draco had never used it, just carried it around. But Harry used the sword. He attacked Lucius Malfoy with it, drew his blood.
Correct,
said Dumbledore. Then why didn't the sword just stick with Harry? Asked Sirius. Why has it attached itself to Draco?
It would attach itself to whichever of them seemed easier to manipulate, said Dumbledore. If the sword is a wish granter, what does Harry have to wish for? Certainly he might want his parents back, but the sword can't raise the dead. Draco's wishes, though, are simpler and make him easier to control.
So Harry is in danger as well as Draco? Dumbledore looked solemn.
He's in danger from Draco. If Draco has, as you say, run off, I would imagine he did it, to some extent, to protect Harry. He must know what is wanted of him.
Sirius's jaw dropped. You can't mean that he was afraid he might kill Harry? Dumbledore just looked at him. Translucent though he was, his gaze was still piercing. Sirius swore. He did say he couldn't promise us he wasn't dangerous, said Lupin softly. We have to find him, said Sirius.
I agree,
said Dumbledore quietly.
It is imperative.
Lupin cleared his throat. I believe that the sword allows him to cloak his location to some degree. I would try a locating charm, but I'm fairly sure it wouldn't work.
No, that would accomplish nothing,
said Dumbledore, his voice sounding faint. Glancing up, Sirius saw that his form had begun to blur around the edges.
And he's taken the epicelical charm with him, hasn't he? A very thorough young man.
Dumbledore's voice suddenly wavered and grew inaudible, as if it were being choked off in mist. We're losing him, Sirius thought, as the stones in the opposite wall appeared through the headmaster's wavering form. He leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair. Professor! For a moment, the wavering outline of the headmaster grew clearer.
Harry, he said. Harry can find him. They may have chosen to shut down the connection that exists between them, but it is still there. Harry can reopen it, if he so chooses.
Sirius heard his own voice crack. How can he do that? But when Dumbledore spoke again, his voice rippled like a voice heard underwater, unintelligible. Sirius fought back the urge to leap to his feet and reach out for the headmaster's wavering form. He thought he saw Dumbledore look at him and wink, before the shards of mist that had held his form flew apart and dissolved into the air. Sirius's eyes dropped to the still form of the man on the bed, whose chest still rose and fell with his quiet breathing. He felt Lupin's hand on his shoulder again, in sympathy rather than restraint this time. I haven't got the faintest idea what to do, Moody, he said quietly. Tell me what to do. I suppose the first thing we should do is to talk to Harry. He needs to know what's going on. It isn't Draco's fault, but the decision to find him should be Harry's. Don't you agree? Sirius didn't reply at first. Do you think the Ministry should be alerted that Draco's missing? Lupin hesitated. Sirius knew he harbored a healthy distrust for the Ministry and its bureaucrats, who, up until 1950, had had a kill first, ask questions later policy when it came to werewolves. I'd rather see if Harry can locate him first. They both turned as the door opened, admitting Snape. Sirius felt the familiar, uncontrollable lurch of dislike in his stomach that he always felt upon seeing him. Snape seemed unsurprised that Dumbledore was gone. He approached the bedside table and began sweeping the belongings he had left there, mortar, pedestal, flask, into his pockets. It's awfully quiet all of a sudden, said Sirius, a quizzical look on his face. Lupin cleared his throat again, looking at Snape. It sounds as if the reporters are gone, he said. Did you, get rid of them? The potions master shook his greasy head. No, I didn't. They found a more interesting story down the hall. Lupin blinked. A more interesting story? Snape straightened up and gave them both a sallow smile. That way lies the wing that houses the criminally insane. As of this morning, it houses one less of them. Sirius looked at him blankly. Lucius Malfoy is dead, said Snape. Murdered in his cell. He was back in the fencing room at Malfoy Manor, facing his father across the flagstones. They had been practicing for an hour, and he was already tired, sweat stinging his eyes, clothes drenched in it. His muscles felt like overextended rubber bands. His father, of course, seemed hardly to have tired at all. But then, Draco thought resentfully, his father wasn't a 13-year-old boy using a weapon far too large and heavy for him. I just want this over, Draco thought despairingly. But he knew his father wouldn't stop the practice until he had either disarmed his son or made him bleed. I've got to disarm him, he thought, and recalled an extremely fancy move he had learned from his father a year ago and had been practicing in secret. He launched into the sequence and saw Lucius's eyes widen in surprise, felt a thrill of victory as the tip of his sword nicked Lucius's hand, before his father lunged forward and slammed the flat of his weapon against Draco's wrist. He stared in dismay as his numb fingers released his blade. It clattered to the flagstone as his father, pale and angry-looking, took hold of the front of his son's shirt and shoved him up against the wall. Draco's head hit the stone with enough force to blacken his vision. Lucius drew his arm back and placed the tip of his sword against the boy's throat. Try to use my own maneuver against me, will you? He demanded, his voice sharp in Draco's ear. That was very, very stupid. As if I would teach you a move I did not know the counter move to. You were just showing off, weren't you, boy? It's your besetting sin. The sharp tip of Lucius's sword nicked his son's throat, and Draco felt the blood begin to flow. Just remember, a smug scholar is only a fool, but a smug swordsman is a dead man. Draco shut his eyes. Yes, Father. Lucius took the blade away, but the cold expression did not leave his eyes.
Sometimes I really wonder if perhaps you want to die.
The dream shifted, and he was flying his broom like he had never flown it before, racing through gathering clouds against a sky slowly darkening to the color of ink. It wasn't just that he flew fast, but recklessly and with precision, grazing the tops of trees, skimming the surface of ponds, turning upside down because he could, until he slowed finally and plunged towards the ground, skidding to a halt. He was on the grounds of Malfoy Manor, at the edge of the bottomless pit. The sky above was iron, streaked with faint charcoal markings, and the pit stretched out in front of him, deep and black and endless. He walked to the edge, knelt down, and reached, without thinking, for the sword behind his shoulder. It sprang to life under his hand, bright silver under the gray twilight, the gems in the hilt glittering like eyes. Without thinking, he ran his left hand over it. Then he sat up, looking at it for a moment, without moving, before sliding his grip on the blade and squeezing hard, feeling the whisper-sharp edges of the sword slicing into his skin. The blood started to flow. He walked to the edge of the pit, looked down, saw only blackness, and threw the sword in. There was no noise as it disappeared into the darkness, flipping end over end, gleaming and turning and vanishing, eaten up by the pit. Feeling extremely weary, he turned his back and walked to his broomstick. But as he bent to pick it up, he saw something glitter in the grass. No, it was the sword, gleaming and bright and perfect. Slowly he reached down and took hold of its hilt. The sword hummed and trembled in his grip, resting there, as if it belonged. Out of unconsciousness, Draco woke suddenly, with a feeling as if he were being suffocated. He gasped for air, and immediately there were hands on his shoulders, and a female voice was telling him to lie back and breathe. A cool hand touched his forehead, brushing back his hair. He blinked hard. "Hermione?" he said faintly, although he knew immediately it couldn't be her. This was someone else. "It's Fleur," said the voice, sounding almost nettled. Draco opened his eyes wide and saw a pale face surrounded by a tinsely cloud of silver hair. Dark blue eyes stared at him, and the familiar mouth set itself into a frown. "Fleur?" he said in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Fleur's frown deepened. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here? Haven't you been expelled?" Now that he was finally awake, Draco had a moment to survey his surroundings. He was back in his and Harry's old room at Magid School, although it looked very different from how they had left it. All of their things had been neatly packed, no doubt awaiting transport back to Malfoy Manor. In his confusion, he couldn't remember how or why he had come here, and then recalled that after he left Charlie's, he couldn't think of anywhere else to hide out. The school had seemed the safest option, although considering that Fleur was in here with him, he supposed he had guessed wrong. She was looking at him oddly now. "It is a little strange that you would come back to a school from which you have been expelled only to fall asleep." "I didn't mean to fall asleep," Draco replied, scanning the room for his broomstick, which he saw propped up by the windowsill. Sitting up from the bed, he got up and made to head in that direction, when Fleur stopped him with a light touch on his arm. "And where do you think you are going?" she asked sardonically. "Generally, when one goes for the broomstick, the answer to that question is usually out." "You can't go yet. she said, looking imperious. "You and I have things we need to discuss." "What things?" he asked, feeling totally lost. She looked at him and smiled. "I think you know." He shook his head. "No, I really don't." "You mean you don't remember you and me in my room? There were butterflies in pretty colors," she added suggestively. He frowned, then remembered the multicolored butterflies and Fleur. Oh no. "You recollect, I see." Draco rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes. "Now really isn't a good time, Fleur. I've had a very, very bad day." She shook her head. No, she said. "You don't get to choose when you repay favors, Draco. That is not the nature of favors. You gave me your word." He looked at her sidelong. It was easy to forget that a rather lively intelligence lived behind the wide eyes and decorative pout. But there it was. "And you never answered my earlier question as to what you're doing in here," he retorted, hoping to change the subject. "You owe me a favor. It makes a connection between us. I felt that you had returned, so I came looking for you," she replied, waving his question away as if the answer should have been obvious. "There, are you happy now?" "Not really, but at least I know you're not stalking me or anything." She smiled slyly at him. "I helped you find that girl of yours," she said coyly. "Now it is time for you to pay up." Draco narrowed his eyes. "How do you know that I went looking for Hermione?" "Remember the villa in the garden at the tower?" "Yes, vividly." She smiled. "Those were my cousins. They told me they met you. They liked you very much." "Those villa? They were your cousins? Is that why they knew who I was?" Fleur shrugged her elegant shoulders. "I had told them about you, of course. I had asked my cousin Flora to check into the Malfoy family bloodline. I wanted to make sure you and I were not too closely related." "Too closely related for what? Marriage?" he said with sarcasm. Then, seeing her expression, he checked himself. "Marriage? Are you mad? I'm 16. "You won't be forever."
"You mean those Vila let me go because they knew you wanted to marry me?"
"Oui,"
said Fleur with exquisite simplicity. Draco goggled at her. "That's ridiculous."
"There's nothing ridiculous about marriage," said Fleur, looking severe.
Draco blinked at her. "You want me to marry you? As a favor?"
Fleur smiled at him, shrugged, and nodded. "Oui."
You sure?" he said in disbelief. "I mean, you could ask me for anything." "Anything? Galleons? I've got lots of galleons."
In answer, Fleur crossed her arms and looked at him with a wry expression. "I don't want galleons," she said. "I want you."
He blinked at her. She was very beautiful in the half-light, and it was rather flattering. He shook his head. "Why me?" he asked. She paused and looked at him. "Why not you?" "Well, you're very beautiful. You could pretty much have anyone. Also, I'm younger than you. I mean, admittedly, I'm fabulously attractive and also very rich, as well as being charming and posh and clever, and all around magnificent and, hang on, all that is starting to sound very convincing. No wonder you like me."
"It's because you are a Majid," said Fleur, and she hooked her foot behind his ankle and yanked. He fell over backward and landed on the floor.
"What the—"
he began, but Fleur knelt down next to him and gracefully settled her robes around herself as she did so, and Draco suddenly felt very apprehensive. "Don't get it twisted," she replied. "I do like you, but you should know what happens to those who break a sacred vow they have made to a villa." He propped himself up on his elbows and shook his head again. If you think that by threatening me you can get me to do whatever you want, he said, and paused. Well, that's where you're right. But I am not saying this because I don't like you. There are plenty of other Majids here at school. I'm hardly the only one. Fleur put her hands on her hips. You have someone else in mind? Well, what about Harry? Fleur looked surprised. Harry? Why not Harry? Said Draco, who couldn't believe he was saying this. I mean, there's nothing wrong with him, really. He's tall, and he's got that dark hair and green eyes, and girls like that, and yes, Harry is also very attractive, but he's far too in love with his girlfriend, she said reasonably. So am I, Draco pointed out. She shook her head. It's not the same. Why not? Snapped Draco irritably, trying to wriggle away from her. Because she doesn't love you back, said Fleur. Thank you for that depressing observation, he said wryly. Would you like to take a knife and stick it in my chest and twist it around a bit? Because I don't think you've quite reached your sadism quota for the evening. In answer, Fleur put her hand on his chest and pushed him down, hard. She then crawled on top of him, letting her long silvery hair fall down around them like a cage of shimmering strands. Now he felt even more apprehensive.
My best friend.
You should not be depressed, she said, poking him in the ribs with her finger. You are a Malfoy. You are rich, and you are famous. And when you grow up a bit, you will be very good-looking. You have powers most people only dream of. And you are part Vila, which is a very good thing to be. You have nothing to be depressed about. What do you mean when I grow up a bit? I'm good-looking now, he protested, propping himself on his elbows. Fleur giggled, and because of the way she was sitting, he actually felt the giggle vibrate through his ribcage. And you've no idea what I'm depressed about, he added. So tell me. And, to his utter amazement, he did. Whether it was out of sheer desperation to tell someone, or that her body language was beginning to show that she wanted something more than just marriage from him in this moment, and he had no intention of complying, he couldn't have said. Perhaps it was a little bit of both. He began by explaining the flight to find Hermione, continuing on through the love potion, and winding up with his visit to his father that afternoon. When he was done, he felt ever so slightly, although not entirely, better. And there you have it, he finished. My father's a maniac, and I'm some kind of spawn of the Dark Lord, and now I should probably kill you before you can go to the ministry. But frankly, I'm too tired. You wouldn't doubt me, said Fleur, curving her lips into a mysterious smile. Unless I wanted you to. That's optimistic of you. Did you miss the part of the story where I'm evil? Oh, evil, said Fleur, making a dismissive gesture with her hand. There is no such thing. She leaned forward and started to run her finger meditatively up and down his sternum. Things are not so black and white as you make them out to be. Oh, great. A lecture on moral relativism. Just what I don't need. My father says I'm evil, and he is an expert in that department, so I think I'm pretty justified in being worried and... Okay, people usually ask before they do that. He grabbed her hand. Did you hear any part of what I just told you? She crossed her arms over her chest and stared down at him, biting her lip in what looked like either thoughtfulness or vexation. He wasn't sure. Are you telling me no? She asked. He narrowed his eyes. I'm telling you, he began, and then broke off, having a strange urge to laugh, but repressed it. Sod it. It's not like I've got a lot of virtue to protect. If you want to kiss me, kiss me. All right, she said, and leaned forward. At first, the kiss landed rather awkwardly on the side of his mouth, so he reached up to take hold of her shoulders, to pull her into a better position. Her mouth was cool and tasted of lemons, and he was just beginning to enjoy it when a thunderous noise split the room. He jerked away from Fleur, who fell to the side, landing on her hands. "Oof!" she said irritably. "What's wrong with you?" But Draco was staring past her, towards the window. A large chunk of brick had, for no apparent reason, torn itself free and collapsed sideways, landing in a clump of debris onto the floor. That was the noise that he had heard. "What?" he began. "Oh," said Fleur, following his gaze. "Yes, that's because we're both magicians, you know. When emotions are generated between us like that." She made a very expressive gesture with her hands. "Boom?" "Boom?" said Draco, staring at her in disbelief. "My kissing you sets off some sort of exploding hex, and all you can say is, boom." She giggled. "It's also because we're both part Vila. It's a very unusual combination, you know. I just think we should make the most of it." She winked at him. "It could be really, really fun." "Fleur," he said, feeling suddenly annoyed. "When I think about myself doing something really, really fun, it usually doesn't end up with me getting myself really, really killed, which I think is what's going to happen here. So I'm sorry, but I'm just going to have to keep on owing you a favor." She smiled sidelong at him. "Not necessarily." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "There is something else you could give me." Ginny stared gloomily into the fire that leapt and sparkled in the grating. Even though it was June, it tended to be so cold in Malfoy Manor that the warmth of the fire was far from unwelcome. Ron was sitting next to her with his arms crossed over his chest, looking both thoughtful and slightly irritated. "What do you think they're talking about?" he asked. Ginny knew immediately who he meant. Their parents, who had retreated with Narcissa to another room for grown-up talk. Ron was more irritated about being left out of the conversation than Ginny was. She had a cold fist of dread in her stomach that even the warmth of the fire couldn't seem to dispel. She kept seeing Draco in her mind's eye, a terrible look of anguish on his face. He didn't want to go. Why had he gone? "I said," Ron repeated irritably, "what do you think they're talking about in there?" Ginny looked at her brother blankly, still seeing Draco's face in her mind. "I'm worried, Ron. I think he's in real danger." Ron looked taken aback. "What, Harry?" he asked, sounding ever so slightly irritable. "Not Harry, Draco. I think he's in danger." Ron looked as if he were fighting the urge to say, "So what?" but instead said, "Look, Malfoy's got Sirius and Narcissa to look after him. I'm sure they'll put all the resources into finding him." "They won't find him. Not if he doesn't want to be found." "Why do you care what happens to Malfoy anyway?" "I'm allowed to care, Ron. You're the only one of us who still hates him," she said coldly. "Harry doesn't consider Malfoy a friend," said Ron, as if that settled the matter. Ginny rolled her eyes. "Can't you let him alone for just 1 second?" Ron sighed, reached out, and took her hand. "Look, Ginny, I can't help it. I will admit that Malfoy really does seem to care about Hermione, and to some extent that makes him human. But I just don't feel comfortable trusting him. And more than anything, I don't want you to get hurt." "What do you mean?" she asked, perhaps sharper than she meant to. "I mean, I've started to wonder about you and Draco." "There is no me and Draco," Ginny interjected, and gave him a stubborn look. "And even if there were, it would be none of your business, would it?" Ron looked exasperated. "Look, all I'm saying is that you can do better than Malfoy, okay?" "Okay, but I'm not the one who's in danger of getting hurt at the moment," said Ginny. He is. I can feel it. There's something working on him, or through him, like me with that diary. She broke off as the door opened and their parents walked out. Molly and Arthur Weasley looked more than a little shell-shocked, and when Molly came forward to hug Ginny, it was with unexpected intensity. "What's going on, Mum?" asked Ginny, pulling away.
"Lupin just got back from the hospital," said Mr. Weasley.
Ron's eyes were wide.
"Is Dumbledore all right?" "He's in a stable condition," said Mr. Weasley, "but Lucius Malfoy is dead."
Ginny's eyes widened.
"Draco's father?"
she whispered. "He's dead?"
"Murdered in his cell,"
said Mr. Weasley. "I think it's time we go home," said Mrs. Weasley. "This is the time for the family, and I can't help but feel that we're intruding." "Not to mention I need to get to the Ministry," added Mr. Weasley. "I've gotten several hours from Percy already."
"We're leaving?"
inquired Ron, still wide-eyed.
"But what about Harry and Hermione?"
"This is Harry's home, love," said Mrs. Weasley firmly. "This is where he belongs and should stay. As for Hermione, Lupin was able to apparate to Charlie's dragon camp before he returned. Together they were able to acquire a portkey for the manor, and she'll be staying here for the time being until such a time they can find a cure for her condition." Ron looked over at Ginny, who looked mournfully back at him. "Can we say goodbye to Harry?" she asked. Mrs. Weasley sighed. "You'll see him again soon enough, I'm sure," she said. "I think it'll be better for everyone if we leave now." When Lupin walked back into the library, he found Harry sitting in a chair, looking distant. "Harry?" The boy looked up at him, and Lupin was shocked to see how empty his eyes were. "Hello, Professor," he said, as if the world were coming to an end. "Is everything all right?" Lupin asked, glancing around the room, then noticed the parchment lying limply in Harry's hands. "Is that the letter from Charlie?" Harry interjected tonelessly. "From Snape, about the potion." "What does it say?" "Nothing useful," replied Harry mildly. "Might I read it?" Lupin asked, and Harry held it out wordlessly for him to take. He came around the desk slowly and plucked it out of his hand, then retreated a step before reading. Harry watched as his eyes scanned the page, knowing already what was there. "Mr. Weasley, the story you sent me is quite unsettling, to say the least, but you were quite right to reach out to me in this matter. Suffice it to say that I do recognize the potion in question from your recitation of Miss Granger's description. It is a very old recipe and quite illegal. In my own materials, it has been called Puck's Bane, or alternatively, the Omnia Vincit charm, from the Latin expression, love conquers all. As for reversals or counterspells, I am sorry to say that there are none outside the death of either the subject or the object of their affection. I know this will be hard for the parties involved to hear, but per your request, I have enclosed a vial of the draught of the living dead for Miss Granger, until such a time that a different solution presents itself, although the chances of that are unlikely. Cordially, Professor Severus Snape." Lupin finished reading in silence, then raised his head to look at Harry. He could see the tension in the boy's shoulders as he sat motionless in the chair. The sun in the stained-glass window threw rich patterns of blue and green squares across his face and white shirt like a painting. A painting of James. "You know, Harry," Lupin began quietly, "just because Snape says there isn't any way of taking it off, doesn't mean it's true.
He's only saying what he knows, and he doesn't know everything." "He said it was curable only by death," Harry replied morosely. "Well, most spells are," Lupin pointed out. Harry set his chin. "Any chance Snape was just trying to be discouraging?" "He does like to be contrary," said Lupin neutrally, although he privately disagreed. If there was one thing Snape wouldn't lie about, it was his beloved potions. "But if it makes you feel any better, I'll be happy to write to the potions masters at Pibarton and Durmstrang. They might be able to help." "With all due respect, Professor, not every problem has a solution," Harry said, his tone undercutting the anger in his voice.
I see the way you look at her.
"True," said Lupin, "but that doesn't mean we give
My
up."
best friend.
But Harry didn't seem to be listening. He was staring at a vague point above the window.
"I think there are some things that just don't get any better, and this is one of them," he said.
"Harry," Lupin began, starting towards him, and in the process nearly knocked a book off the desk as he did so. Reflexively, he caught it in one hand, and Harry turned at the sound. He glanced down at it, and an odd look crossed his face.
"What's that?"
"The book I've been trying to translate," Lupin replied. Harry looked at it, noticing that Lupin had accidentally caught the spine so that the book itself was open in his hand.
"I'm not sure why you're having such a problem translating that book, Professor," he said and shrugged. "It's in English."
Lupin jumped.
"It's what?"
Harry gave him an odd look.
"It's in English."
Lupin didn't know whether to sputter or shout. He flipped the book over in his hand and stared at the pages, seeing the same incomprehensible squiggles and curlicues that he remembered. He turned the book around again and handed it to Harry.
"Read me that bit, Harry," he said.
Harry gave him a look that clearly said, "You're off your onion, aren't you? But I'm going to indulge you anyway because you seem basically harmless otherwise." Lupin endured it as Harry took the book and read.
"Saturday, the 14th of October. Drank too much last night. Woke up with dreadful headache, only to find blasted Godric stomping about, yelling again. Merlin's beard, he just never stops yelling. It's great for terrifying the peasantry, but
I see the way you look
not all that pleasant if you're trying to enjoy your breakfast. Then, at the meeting today, he took issue with my request that we keep the school closed to all non-pure-blooded students. Wouldn't listen to a single one of my arguments."
Harry broke off and looked up at Lupin with round eyes.
"Professor, what is this?"
"Well," said Lupin, "as a professional historian and academic, I'd have to say that I need to run tests to determine anything. Perhaps a verificarum spell, but, well..." He trailed off and smiled at Harry.
"It certainly looks like it could be Salazar Slytherin's diary."
"When you look at this book," said Harry, stabbing a finger at the page,
"it doesn't look like English to you."
"It isn't English, Harry," said Lupin. "It's Parseltongue." He smiled.
"It didn't even occur to me that it might be a written language."
Harry suddenly frowned violently as a sudden thought struck him.
"Does this mean I'm going to have to read the whole book to you out loud?"
he asked, staring at Lupin in dismay.
"Not all of it," said Lupin.
Then his smile faded as he continued.
"At the moment I need to speak with Narcissa about securing that demon. And just so you know, Hermione's at the manor."
Harry's eyes widened.
"If you want to see her, she's in one of the upstairs bedrooms," Lupin said gently.
Harry flushed.
"Oh, I don't know. I think it would do you good," Lupin continued, and took the book out of Harry's grasp.
Harry hesitated a moment before replying.
"Did you give her the draft of the Living Dead already?"
Lupin was startled by Harry's tone.
I know.
He sounded nervous, lost, and maybe just a little bit afraid.
"Yes,"
he said after a moment.
She'll be sleeping for a longer period of time now. At least until we can come up with some other way to house her. But for now, you can see her without any, side effects of the potion. Will she even know I'm there?
Harry asked, his voice slightly strained. Lupin didn't know how to respond, mostly because he wasn't as familiar with that particular potion as Snape was, and partly because he was afraid of what telling Harry no might do to him.
I think any kind word in her ear would be the best thing for her, even if she is sleeping. Consider the fact that the real Hermione is somewhere in there, under that potion, and I think she would like to hear from the one person in the world she loves best of all.
Bugger off and quit following me, Black. Sirius was stalking down the corridor towards the wing of St. Mungo's that housed the criminally insane. Snape was by his side, the fire in his beetle-black eyes betraying his fury. Go home. This is ministry business. Sirius shook his head, still walking. I'm not going home. I'm going to see what happened to Lucius Malfoy. I've got a right. You've got no right, said Snape, glaring at Sirius with undiluted hatred. The guards will never let you in. Lucius Malfoy's death is no concern of yours. Sirius felt the fury boil up inside his chest. It is my concern. He's my stepson's father. Well, soon-to-be stepson. It doesn't matter. Look, it really isn't any business of yours, you goat-faced, weasel-footed tosser. They were nearing the end of the hallway now. Sirius could see a tight knot of ministry wizards standing in front of a numbered cell door. Snape glanced at them, then coldly at Sirius. I am here representing the ministry, he said. Looking into Lucius Malfoy's death is part of my job. You, on the other hand, are merely a blot on the landscape, contributing nothing. Sirius wasn't sure at what point he had lost his temper, but it was definitely gone. As an aura, I've a hell of a lot more place here than you. Why don't you just go on home to the potions dungeon and get back to unfairly punishing little boys because you get such a kick out of it? That seems to be what you're good at. Snape sneered viciously. I'd just like to tell you that those 12 years you spent in Azkaban were the best years of my life. Every morning I woke up with a smile on my face and a song in my heart, just knowing you were in there. What song would that be? I may be a weasel-faced tosser, but I've got an enormous broom shoved up my fuck, you Black. Look, Snape, I beat you up in school, and I'd be more than happy to do it again. If you ever think about trying to prevent me from going into that cell, I will rip out your windpipe and garrote you to death with it. And I don't care if they send me back to Azkaban, because it would be worth it. Got that? Snape looked at him, and Sirius was disconcerted to see the beginnings of a cold smile on his face. Fine, he said. I hope you like what you're going to see. As it turned out, the ministry guards were surprisingly willing to let Sirius and Snape into the cell to view what remained of Lucius Malfoy. Partly it had been Sirius's face and reputation as a top-flight Auror. Partly it had been Snape's ministry status. And partly it had been the fact that nobody else wanted to go in there. It was easy to see why. On walking into the room, Sirius, who had seen quite a few nasty things during his tenure as an Auror, nearly felt his legs give out. There was no body, or at least nothing remained of Lucius Malfoy that could accurately be termed a body. Blood drenched the furniture, splattered the walls, made viscous pools on the floor. The thin circle Lucius had drawn using his own blood was nearly obscured by long streaks of flesh. Other things lay scattered about the room. Things Sirius didn't want to look at too closely. Things that looked a lot like mangled limbs and organs. "Well," said Sirius, feeling lightheaded, "I think we can rule out suicide." "Not necessarily," said Snape, who hadn't so much as changed expression since they'd entered the cell. "What, you think he got so depressed that he hacked himself into pieces?" "No," said Snape coldly, and pointed towards one of the walls with his wand. "Have you looked at those?" "Bloodstains," said Sirius. "So what?" "I suppose it was optimistic of me to expect you to notice anything, Black. Look at the bloodstains." "They look like writing," said Sirius, squinting at the wall. "It appears to be some kind of runic language." Snape took out a notepad and a quick quotes quill, and seemed to be copying down the writing. "Looks like fire letters," he muttered to himself. "The aftermath of a summoning spell, perhaps." "I wonder what he was trying to summon," Sirius said. "It's too difficult to read to determine. Yes, if only he'd been a bit more careful while scrolling his dying message in his own blood. Don't try to be funny, Black. You're not amusing." "I was trying to keep myself from being sick," said Sirius. "You're probably used to this sort of carnage from your days as a fun-loving Death Eater." Snape looked at him with hooded eyes. "I do recall the Dark Lord visiting a rather impressive punishment upon those who disobeyed him," he said. "The Eruptus curse. It blows people apart," said Sirius hollowly. "Quite. And it's difficult to perform?" "Very. Anything else to say on that topic?" "Not really, no." "Doesn't it just make you sick?" Snape glanced up at him. "Excuse me?" "To remember what you were," said Sirius harshly, and was gratified to see Snape's expression tighten. "I know Dumbledore told me you turned away from the Dark Lord, at great risk to yourself. He seems to put great stock in you. But I'll tell you, the rest of us don't. Without him to speak for you, who in the magical community is going to be able to summon up that much trust in a failed Death Eater who couldn't even keep faith with the Dark Lord?" "Better a failed Death Eater," said Snape, "than a failed secret keeper." Sirius felt his stomach lurch and felt a sudden urge to hit Snape. "Excuse me," said a voice from the door. Both men turned and saw a guard standing there. It was the same guard who had given Draco entrance to the cell earlier. He was looking supremely nervous, and made certain to avert his eyes from the gore on the inside of the cell. "Who are you?" asked Sirius, his voice gritty. "My name is Edward. Edward Cobb. I was the one who found the cell. Well, anyway, he said I should talk to you both, seeing how one of you's from the Ministry." The man hedged. "Who said?" inquired Snape, sounding just as short-tempered as Sirius. "The boss," replied Mr. Cobb. "See, earlier today I admitted this man's son into this very cell." "Draco?" Sirius exclaimed. Yeah," said Mr. Cobb, a little shocked that Sirius had guessed the name right off. "What was young Malfoy doing here?" asked Snape silkily. "I really couldn't say," answered Mr. Cobb, and by his stance, Sirius could tell that the man wasn't lying. "And how long after he left did you find the cell in this condition?" pressed Snape. Sirius shot him a hard glance. "You can't honestly believe that." "I don't believe anything, Black," Snape said shortly. "I am merely asking questions. Mr. Cobb, if you please, how long?" Mr. Cobb looked from one man to the other before he swallowed and said, 30 minutes, at most." "Thank you, Mr. Cobb," said Snape, and checked his quick quotes quill to make certain it had gotten that piece of information. We need to speak with you again. Someone will be in touch.
I know.
Mr. Cobb nodded, looking more than a bit relieved to be dismissed, and fled the room. Sirius waited a beat to make certain that the man was gone before glowering at Snape. You think that Draco had something to do with killing his own father? I don't understand you. He's in your house. You've taught him for nearly 7 years. How can you possibly think he's capable of such a thing? Snape glowered right back. You want to know the one thing I hate about you Gryffindors the most? He asked. It's your juvenile ability to believe the best in everyone. You forget, Black, that I received a letter from Charlie Weasley explaining in detail all the sordid events that have occurred in the past 24 hours or so. A resurrected Hogwarts founder, a demon sword that might have the ability to warp the mind of the one who carries it. These are facts. Yes, Mr. Malfoy may be in my house, but that doesn't mean that I won't investigate this matter as if he doesn't have a motive. Lucius was not a terribly kind parent, if idle gossip is to be believed. So that's it then, said Sirius with finality. You're just going to send the magical law enforcement after him, just like that? No, said Snape, and snapped his notebook shut. It and his quill disappeared into the sleeves of his robe as he walked towards the door, brushing by Sirius, who didn't move. Before leaving, Snape turned and looked at him, his beetle-black eyes full of hate, and something else as well.
I know.
But rest assured that I will give a thorough account of his presence to the Ministry when I return, he said, and went out. Sirius passed the back of his hand across his eyes and swore softly. Did I lose that document? He wondered. He heard Snape's voice in his head again. Failed secret keeper. He pushed back thoughts of James and Lily, because that way was darkness. That way was the headaches that lasted for hours and hours. Already the coppery smell of blood was making him nauseated. He took a step backwards and felt his foot come down on something that squished unpleasantly. Merlin's beard, he thought to himself and glanced down. Is that a finger? Sirius left the cell with as much dignity as his quick feet would muster. Harry climbed the seemingly endless stairs of Malfoy Manor, turning right, and walked down a narrow corridor. He wasn't precisely sure where Hermione was, but felt certain that he should be able to sense it when he got to the right room. He turned another corner, and then another, and came out into a hallway he was positive he had seen before. And there, in the middle of a long line of doors, was a narrow oak one that looked oddly familiar. His feet felt like lead as he walked towards it, and put his hand on the doorknob and pushed. Inside was a small bedroom with stone walls and a bedspread with a design of blue flowers. Harry recalled that this was the bedroom that Narcissa had chosen for Hermione to change in when she had first arrived at the manor last year, then disguised as Draco's girlfriend.
My best friend.
He winced at the memory, as that time had been very tumultuous for their relationship, and this time was shaping up to be no better. A few candles had been lit inside the room, which gave it a soft glow, which should have been peaceful, but instead gave Harry an eerie feeling, almost as if he were walking into someone's tomb. Hermione was stretched out on the bed, which did little to calm his nerves or make him feel any less strange. Someone, probably Narcissa, had magicked off her clothes she had been wearing for the last few days, and had replaced them with simple blue robes. Her feet were bare, but a thin sheet of some kind of material had been thrown carefully over her body. If Harry had to guess, it was more than likely enchanted so that she would be set to a constant temperature. Something more comfortable than the chill he had come to expect from staying in Malfoy Manor. The material shimmered faintly in the light of the candles, and he could see her chest rise and fall with her light breathing. That small movement made him able to put one foot in front of the other, until at last he was standing beside her. "Hello, Hermione," he said, and somehow those simple words made him feel slightly awkward. He decided to try something else, and reached out to take her hand. It was warm, and that made him feel slightly better somehow. "You know I'm not very good at just talking for the sake of talking, but Lupin said that I should come and see you." Her hand was limp in his, so he decided to continue. "I'm not sure what to say to you. This state that you're in makes me feel like you're dead, but I know that isn't true." He took a deep breath and pressed on. "I did want to say that when I first found out about this potion, I was convinced that it meant that you didn't love me anymore. Ron sorted me out on that front, which I'm sure would come as no surprise to you. I really wish you were awake right now, and I could ask you whatever I wanted. Like, if you really liked that present I got you last Christmas. I know girls don't usually go in for socks, but it would still be nice to know if you liked them. Or if you really find Quidditch interesting, or do you only come to the games to make sure I don't get killed? I've always wondered about that, to be honest. Or if you believe that there is a counterspell to this love potion, because I want to believe that there's a counterspell. But Professor Snape said..." Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door, and Harry turned to see Lupin standing there, looking a little shy about interrupting him. "Do you need help with that book, Professor?" asked Harry, who hastily dropped Hermione's hand and turned to look at the man. "I might in a bit," Lupin admitted. "I'm considering various translation spells, and have managed to get quite a few paragraphs into a readable form already." "Anything interesting?" "No, mostly just complaints about Godric and, observations about Rowena. He's quite a complainer." Lupin shook his head as if clearing it. "But that isn't what I came up here to tell you. I meant to say that Ron and Ginny have been taken home by their parents, and Sirius has returned."
I know.
Harry felt a little stunned to hear that his friends had gone without saying goodbye, but decided that he'd consider that question later.
My best friend.
At the moment, there seemed to be something more pressing on Lupin's mind, so he decided to get straight to the heart of the matter. "Is Sirius okay?" "Yes," said Lupin, seeming surprised by the question. "He's managed to get in contact with Charlie and discuss the transfer of that demon, which we've managed to accomplish. It's now locked up in one of Lucius's cells, but there's some other things that require our immediate attention, and we need your help, Harry." Harry looked at him questioningly, so Lupin decided to continue. "Do you remember after you and Draco took the Plagiarized potion, how, to some extent, you knew what he was thinking?" he asked without preamble. "Yeah?" said Harry, raising his eyebrows. "Did that go away once the potion wore off?" Lupin asked seriously. "Well," said Harry, and looked slightly uncomfortable. "Not exactly." "Go on," Lupin pressed. Harry took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. "I don't know what Malfoy's thinking, if that's what you're asking me," he said, "and I certainly don't know where he is, but I can sometimes tell what he's feeling." Lupin looked slightly astounded. "And you never told anyone?" "I figured because anyone I told would find it just as weird and disturbing as I do. Harry replied. Also, it's fading. I feel it less every day. Why? Well, we think it might be necessary to go through other channels to find him. Other channels? Echoed Harry. But Hermione should have the other epicilical charm on her. Couldn't we just use that to find him? Lupin shook his head. We have no guarantee that he hasn't done something to the other charm that would prevent us from using it. What about the Ministry? Sirius said it was best if we don't inform the Ministry about Draco's whereabouts for the time being, said Lupin, wishing that Sirius was upstairs to help him out with this conversation. Harry looked suspicious at Lupin's abrupt change in topic, but decided to ignore it, for now. What can I do? Well, it's entirely up to you, Lupin began, but that connection you two had through the Polyjuice potion, it isn't a connection that's at all unheard of. It is very similar to the connection one might find between a Majid and their source. Whatever bonded you to each other, it hasn't been dissolved, merely shut down. You can open that channel back up, I believe, if you want to. It would be perfectly understandable if you didn't want to, because he's dangerous, said Harry. Yeah, I know he thinks he is. It's more than that, Harry, said Lupin. He isn't just dangerous. He's dangerous specifically to you. You can locate him for us, but you can't go with us to find him. We'll have to do that. Harry looked blank. Why? Lupin sighed and explained. Harry's eyes grew wide, but he didn't look as surprised as Lupin had thought he would. Slytherin blood, he said finally, looking grave. So that's why the Sorting Hat wanted to put me in Slytherin. You're not a Slytherin, Harry, said Lupin firmly, whatever your genetic inheritance might be. Yeah, I know, said Harry calmly. I guess this is one of the downsides of being a Majid. I mean, the sword wouldn't have any interest in me if I wasn't one, would it? There are always drawbacks to power, said Lupin. It's a good thing to know. Harry fell silent for a moment, gazing off into space, as if the answers to Draco's whereabouts could be found in the emptiness of the room. But the moment passed swiftly, and he turned to look at Lupin and said solemnly, Let's get started. As the two of them left, they made sure to close the door firmly behind them. The candles guttered ever so slightly as the soft breeze from the door passed through the room. There was a short silence. Then the hand that Harry had been holding mere moments before twitched, almost imperceptibly. Hermione's mouth opened just a fraction of an inch, and her breath, when it expelled from her sleeping lungs, sounded very much like a single, solitary word. Harry. It was nearly dark when Severus Snape arrived home. He had been kept a long time at St. Mungo's, speaking with the meta-wizards about Dumbledore's treatment, and an even longer time with his debriefing at the Ministry. Mounting the steps of his home slowly, he could see the clear red light of the sinking sun casting dark shapes between the trees in the distance. It was dusk, and, as it often did when he was very tired, the dark mark on his arm ached like a long-healed wound. As he crossed the threshold of his house, he felt something slightly off-kilter.
I know.
It was still, dark, lightless inside, as he had left it, but there was something subtly wrong. He drew his wand out of his sleeve and moved quietly down the hall, his ears pricked for any sign of an intruder. Halfway down, he heard a noise, but it wasn't any kind of noise that he had expected. It was music, and it was coming from his own living room. Indignation overcame caution, and Snape strode the rest of the way down the hall, not bothering to try and mask his footsteps. At the end of the hall, he swung to the left and threw the door open. A bizarre sight met his eyes. The room was furnished with heavy wooden chairs, stiff and uncomfortable. The walls were lined with books, the floor very dusty, and any light that might have found its way through the windows was blocked by heavy canvas drapes. The only difference was that in the middle of the room, in the center of a circular Persian rug of which he had always been rather fond, sat Draco Malfoy. It took a moment for Snape to recognize his favorite student, who was dressed in one of the most ridiculous get-ups that the potions master had ever seen. He looked calm, and not the least bit startled to see him. In his outstretched palm, and hovering a few inches above it, was a circular black disc. A record. It was spinning rapidly, as if on a turntable, and music was coming from it. Snape couldn't help himself. He stared. "That's quite a collection of Muggle music you've got," said Draco, looking calmly up at Snape. "I'd never even heard of the Bay City Rollers until I started leafing through your collection." Snape stared at his erstwhile student and shook his head. "Mr. Malfoy," he said coldly, "would you like to tell me what you're doing here? I imagine a simple curiosity about my record collection is not the answer." Draco looked at him blankly for a moment, then smiled. There was something odd about that smile, Snape thought. It wasn't the smile of a teenage boy. It wasn't even Draco's usual nasty smile. It was something else again. "I thought maybe you could help me," he said simply. Snape shook his head again, feeling cautious. "Help you? Why would you be needing my help? And while we're on the subject, how did you get in here anyway?" Draco's smile broadened. "I can do lots of things," he said, glancing at the still spinning record hovering above his hand. "But to answer your question, I cut through the lock on your front door, then I repaired it. It's as good as it ever was. It didn't damage anything." Snape's lips tightened. "You shouldn't be here. And even though you are one of my own students, you'll have to concede that this is a bit much." "Surely you're not going to suggest that I go home?" asked Draco, who appeared to have acquired the shamelessness of real desperation. Snape paused. In the back of his mind, he knew that he should call for help from the Ministry. After all, he could be dealing with a dangerous fugitive who murdered his father and might, at this very moment, be possessed by a demon sword. He decided to wait a bit and tried a different tack. "Black was worried about you today," he said, not in a particularly kind tone. "It strikes me that he and the rest of your family would be perfectly happy to help you. Why don't you go to them?" "Because they don't understand," said Draco, scrambling up to his knees. "They're all the same. Sirius, Harry, the rest of them. They're all good. They've always been good. They don't know any other way to be. To them, evil is something to be despised and held at arm's length, not something that walks beside you every day and every night of your life. They don't know how to fight it because they've never had to fight it. But you know." He looked up, and Snape saw his face made younger by shock and exhaustion. "You did bad things, but you came back," Draco continued. "I thought you might understand. I thought you might tell me how you did it." Snape looked at him, his favorite student, a boy he had always been rather fond of, for no reason he could decipher, given that he detested Draco's father. But there it was. Draco had fallen silent, watching the black circular disc spin lazily in his hand. He had a dreamy half-smile on his face, as if he were thinking of something else now, somewhere else he would like to be. "Perhaps I can help you," said Snape after a fashion. "But first, there's something you should know." "What?" "Your father's dead," said Snape with brutal calm, making sure to study the boy's face for any signs of guilt. "He died shortly after you left his cell." Draco didn't move, but went suddenly, startlingly white. The dark light behind his eyes seemed to crumble momentarily, leaving them translucently clear, windows of shock and loss. The spinning disc cracked in half with a sound like a broken bone, and the pieces rained down onto the carpet. Draco looked up at Snape, his face made childlike again with astonished desolation. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," said Snape, now almost positive that Draco had had nothing to do with the incident. He would have to be certain to let the Ministry know as soon as possible. But for now... Snape turned to leave the room. "Stay where you are, Mr. Malfoy," he said. "I'll get you some tea." And that is all for this one, guys. So if you think that by threatening me you can get me to do whatever you want, well, that's where you're right, is from real genius. So, as always, if you are enjoying the content that you are listening to, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And in my About section here on this channel, you can find a link to my Patreon for those of you that are interested supporting me there. I also keep on forgetting to mention that I have a Ko-fi. If you guys want to buy me a coffee or anything of that nature. Or I should say tea, as I'm not actually a fan of coffee. But yeah, that's it for this one, guys. And I will see you all in the next one. Good night.